Well, it's February the 8th, and we're on the beginning of Trump's second impeachment trial. So I thought, while we're waiting for that all to happen, we might address something else that's a little bit more long term, I think, and that is this whole climate change policy that the Biden administration is pushing through. Um, and So there's a whole background. As we all know that this climate change issue, um, well, ideas along this line have been around for a long time. I can recall, I don't know, way back, when I was a lot younger, although it didn't have any popularity at the time, and there were differing theories. But I think what all got it started was back in the 80s during the final phase of the Cold War. There was a theory that was put out called nuclear winter, and a group of climate people got in with some political activists, and they basically come up with some models which showed that if a nuclear war occurred, that would create some kind of a big ice age kind of effect and freeze everybody to death, and therefore that's was why we should be really ultra more afraid of nuclear war, ignoring the fact that the known effects of nuclear war are adequate enough for reasons to not want to have a nuclear war. I mean, when you really look at what would really happen, even the prompt effects would probably kill off a third to half the populations of the competing countries. So let's get into all that, and of course the after effects of starvation, disease, and we don't have to go through all the bad news. Did we need nuclear winter on top of it? I don't know. At any rate, arms control went forward. The Cold War calmed down. Arms reduction treaties were passed. Gorbachev, and then the fall of the Soviet Union, and everybody stopped worrying about that in the public sphere. So what are these people going to do? Well, their next big thing, since we're using politics and climate modeling, what about CO2 emissions creating global warming, right? So then that's where this whole thing got going. And so I want to mention that you're also, again, I should mention up front here, please subscribe if you want to get these videos, and like and forward them, ring the bell or whatever, because I need to grow the site here. I thank all those that have subscribed. But I want to get back into this real quick. So this thing went on, and back around 1990 or so, they kept saying, well, there's only like 10 years left. We have to do something. And I remember a movie that came out of which they showed London being flooded around, and it was a science fiction kind of movie set around the year 2000 or so, 10 years in the future or so, and it was London was flooded, and all these extreme ideas. And this has been a continual refrain. We got 10 or 12 years left before the point of no return, and that was true in 2000. It was true in 2010, and now they're coming back saying the same thing again. And the question is, obviously they've been pretty decisively wrong for at least 20 to 30 years on making these claims. I guess you could say 20 years, because the ones from 2010 have obviously not happened yet. In fact, I think the increases in climate warming have kind of moderated, and there was a big surge in the late 90s. But and by big surge, I mean not that big, really, but there was actual global increases in that period, and there's continual battling over how you measure it, whether it's ground level measurements or satellite based measurements and the like. Point is, though, and aside from that subject, the question is, do they really have a serious, viable, zero emissions economic plan? Is there any practical way to do what they're talking about, and especially in the time frames they're talking about? And the answer, I think, is quite probably mostly no, and particularly not the way they're going about it. You'd have to have some really exotic new technologies introduced, I think, in order to pull that off. And that's not what they're going with. They're going with ground-based solar panels and windmills and things of that sort. And that's not going to be adequate to produce the energy we need. And I guess GM, I think, was saying they're going to quit making gasoline-powered cars by 2030. I mean, electric cars are going to have a major problem. I mean, how I mean, how are we going to travel to any great extent they're probably okay for commuting to work, and short drives of that sort, assuming the commute isn't that long, but how long? I mean, when you run low on power, how long does it take you to recharge it? And are there going to be enough charging stations? And where are we going to get the energy for those charging stations? What about the environmental issues of dealing with the metals and like lithium that are involved in making all these lithium batteries on the scale of these cars? How long will these lithium batteries last? And what will the expense be to do this to people? I mean, this is a major hit. And while we're doing all this stuff, supposedly, the rest of the world really isn't to any great extent, except maybe Europe, and I'm not even in their whole different situation. But in reality, this whole idea is not very viable. Now, and at the same time, we see the interesting paradox that the one source of energy for electricity that would be non-CO2 emissions oriented would be nuclear. But they're against nuclear. And the other possibility is a little more out there, but it's not totally a joke. I've actually sat through several presentations on this on the space show, which is the idea of space solar power. And that involves putting gigantic solar panels in space and using microwaves to beam energy down to Earth to receptive antennas. Sounds a bit far out, but it does have some potential promise. But the problem is, at this point, it's probably not economically viable in the near term, except for specialized applications like sending power to remote outposts, or maybe for military bases in faraway areas where otherwise you'd have to bring in diesel fuel or something through terrorist-controlled roads and stuff, that sort of thing. But other than those sorts of limited applications, mass application is probably not here yet. And I mean, we haven't really done much in the way of even doing prototyping on it yet. So again, I think making a commitment to such a extreme goal when the real threat is still, I think, quite questionable. I mean, in all this discussion, we haven't seen a lot of objectivity in the scientific community, really. Essentially, this global climate change theory is being promoted very much the same way as other political ideologies are being promoted, which is basically, if you have a countervailing viewpoint, we suppress your work, we don't give you a job, we make sure you don't get tenured, you don't get federal funding, and therefore that suppresses those kind of viewpoints and probably reduces the quality of people that are involved in it. Plus, let's face it, if you're a climatologist, what's not to like? Government grants, a good career, and you can write all kind of ambiguous papers which says that, it could be this bad, and we need more research to make sure. I mean, what's to be gained by them if they were to say, well, really, it's probably not that serious of a problem, right? That wouldn't be good for their funding, even if they could somehow survive it in the academic community saying that. So I think, all in all, we have a questionable threat at best, without a practical solution to the threat available, and yet we're pursuing these policies, reducing our energy supplies and throwing people out of work immediately without having a viable alternative actually being created. So I think that this kind of shows the wrong-headedness of this kind of policies. I mean, the Obama administration's trips into solar really ended up being a bust. And it probably is a bust here, too. I mean, we are doing low-level solar, putting it in sunny areas, putting panels on roofs and stuff like that. But in general, I think that that this whole thing is kind of, going out of way. And the objective of going to zero car emissions by 2050 is probably kind of ludicrous. And it's certainly not going to be done, I don't think, without a massive commitment to nuclear energy. And we still have to address the question of, okay, how do we get fuel for things where you can't use electricity, like aircraft, and so forth. So anyway, I just kind of want to make that this is kind of a wrong-headed policy of the Biden administration, which is kind of going forward, but I think for really ill gains. On the other hand, I do think one of the major failures of the Trump period was to not address this thing on a more intellectual basis. I mean, Trump just went ahead to create, energy resources, open up lands to drilling, but didn't seem to realize you need to also attack the ideology behind the climate change religion, if you will. Because without actually promoting countervailing arguments with government money and power, the existing establishment just pursued right ahead with their ongoing approach, and ended up now getting reelected, and so now they're just back to the same old game again. I also find it interesting, one last thing to mention on politics, I kind of addressed that a little bit in my last video, but I'll do that real quickly before I close this one. And that is, I'm amazed at the weakness of the senators from energy states, particularly Joe Manchin and John Tester, who actually got amendments passed with Republican votes that were favorable in the latest, big COVID bill, and then turned around and voted for the Schumer amendment, which completely wiped out what they just got passed. I mean, are these people for real? Are they prepared to stand up for their own state's interest? It's very frightening, and given that we're counting on them to prevent a complete breakdown of the constitutional system in a way, it is a bit of a frightening situation. Well, I'll close this for now, but I think this is kind of something to think about while we're waiting to see how this upcoming impeachment trial proceeds and what kind of polemics come out of it. Thanks for watching. Until next time.